Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Hood Museum of Art. I'm Juliette Bianco, Interim Director of the museum, and it's a great pleasure to welcome you to our program this evening. First, I'm so happy to recognize the Hood Museum of Art's Board of Overseers, who are with us for their fall meeting today and tomorrow. Led by Chair Jonathan L. Cohen, class of 1960, Tuck 61, the board is thoroughly dedicated to the museum and its teaching mission. Its members are providing critical support of the museum's exciting expansion plans and are equally generous in sharing their time and expertise. Thank you so much for being with us tonight. In celebration of the transformative legacy of the Wheel family at the Hood Museum of Art, and to introduce tonight's guest speaker, I am very happy now to introduce Bonnie McAdam, the Jonathan L. Cohen Curator of American Art at the Hood Museum of Art, who helped to curate the exhibition upstairs. We invite you after the lecture for refreshments and to enter 18th century Venezia with us in the galleries above. Thank you.
So our focus tonight is our exhibition of Canaletto's Vedute prints, which the Hood organized with the Montgomery Museum of Fine Arts, or the MMFA, in honor of the centenary of the birth of Adolf Wheel Jr., better known to us as Bucks. A member of Dartmouth class of 1935, Bucks Wheel was an astute and generous collector who over his lifetime amassed one of the most impressive collections of old master prints in this country. In addition to the Canaletto etchings, it features stunning impressions by such masters as Rembrandt, Dürer, Callot, and Goya, and other luminaries in the history of printmaking. The Hood is extremely fortunate to have received the bulk of Mr. Wheel's collection, which his wife Jean donated in his memory after his death in 1995. Bucks lived in Montgomery, Alabama, and he and other members of the Wheel's family, including his brother Robert, class of 1940, and daughter, Dr. Lori Jean Wheel, have generously supported the MMFA as well as the Hood. We're delighted to have with us tonight Lori Wheel, a Hood overseer and MMFA trustee, as well as her husband, Thomas Wool. At the reception following this lecture, President Hanlon will comment on the generous legacy of the Wheel family at Dartmouth. If you've not yet seen the exhibition, I really encourage you to do so this evening. It's a remarkable suite of beautiful impressions by Giovanni Anton Canal, better known as Canaletto, who was one of the greatest etchers of the 18th century. Although best known for his painted views of Venice's grand monuments, his shimmering, light-filled etchings present another, more intimate and imaginative view of the city and its environs. We can ask for no better authority to introduce us to Canaletto and to 18th century Venice than this evening's speaker, Frederick Ilchman, who is Chair, Art of Europe, and the Mrs. Russell W. Baker Curator of Paintings at the MFA, Boston. He received his PhD from Columbia with a dissertation on Jacopo Tintoretto's early career, and his BA in Art and Archaeology, summa cum laude, from Princeton. A specialist in the art of the Italian Renaissance, he's curated numerous exhibitions, organized international conferences, contributed to scholarly publications, and lectured and taught in the United States and abroad. Dr. Ilchman's acclaimed 2009 exhibition, Titian, Tintoretto, Veronese, Rivals in Renaissance Venice, organized by the MFA with the Musée du Louvre, was the first major exhibition dedicated to the competition among these three renowned artists and the emergence of their signature styles. The exhibition won several awards, including Outstanding Exhibition from the Association of Art Museum Curators, or AAMC, and was selected as one of the year's top 10 exhibitions by the Wall Street Journal. He also co-curated the insightful 2014 exhibition, Goya, Order and Disorder. I hope some of you have seen those two landmark exhibitions. They were absolutely stunning and really enlightening. Early in his MFA career, he served as the Boston curator of the major 2003 traveling Thomas Gainsborough exhibition organized by the Tate Britain, and helped to plan the 2007 exhibition on Tintoretto at the Museo del Prado. His essay for the catalog also won an award from the AAMC. In 2012, he co-curated the exhibition Paolo Veronese, a master in his workshop at the Ringling Museum in Sarasota, and the following year curated for the MFA Visiting Masterpiece, Piero della Francesca's Senigallia Madonna, an Italian treasure stolen and recovered. In addition to his lauded exhibitions and prodigious publications, Dr. Ilchman is also a member of the board and project director of Save Venice Incorporated, the largest private committee dedicated to preserving the cultural patrimony of Venice. So please join me in welcoming Frederick Ilchman, whose title of his lecture is Viewing 18th Century Venice with Canaletto and Casanova.
Buonasera. Excellent. Okay. I'm very happy to be here with you this evening and to share with you my love of Venice and of Canaletto. These two, the magical city built upon the water and its greatest view painter, are inextricable. Knowledge of each one will help you learn a bit more about the other. No, don't worry. I'm going to get to Casanova a little later. But the occasion of my talk, of course, is that this fall we're celebrating an exhibition upstairs of Canaletto etchings and the continuing resonance of the gift of these splendid etchings to the museum, plus many other prints collected by Adolf Weil Jr., class of 35. Now, one of my main goals now is to convince any skeptics here about the beauty and artistic importance of etchings. Just because these works are multiples and not unique objects, they're not drawings, and just because they're black and white and not colored, and thus unlike paintings, doesn't mean they're second-class citizens in the art world. No, on the contrary. Etchings should be appreciated for their technical mastery, their refinement, their delicacy, their insistence as a printmaking process in requiring the visitor, to look closely, carefully, and patiently. With etchings, you can not only pull a number of impressions and thus find a bigger audience. You can indeed find more viewers that way. You also get amazingly clean lines in a print. Whenever an ink pen changes, when you're making a drawing, an ink pen changes angle, direction on the sheet, the ink pools and spreads out at that point, ruining the really clean line. And that's something wonderful about etchings. And with etchings, of course, these are not just any etchings we're talking about. We're talking about ones made by Canaletto, who was the greatest painter, draftsman, and etcher of views of Venice. And his reputation rests equally on his topographic views, known as vedute, and their actual views, then as now the major sites of Venice. St. Mark's Square, the Bacino di San Marco, that is the Bay of Venice, the Rialto Bridge, other major churches and palazzi. And his other half of his oeuvre was capricci, that is invented views or landscapes, made up scenes, often employing actual buildings but recomposed in incongruous ways. And we're going to examine a number of these prints together, both topographic views and capricci, or at least slides of them. Of course, the originals are upstairs. I'm sure you'll be convinced or reminded of their aesthetic significance. Now, Canaletto seems to have started working on a set of etchings as early as 1735, but we can get a publication date of 1744 from the frontispiece of the set, and you can see that we're looking at a set of stone steps that go down to some water. You still see this all the time in Venice. There's two boys and a man in turban looking up at this huge inscription on the side, and it says it's dedicated to the English ambassador to Venice, Consul Giuseppe Smith, or Joseph Smith, consul of His Britannic Majesty to the Most Serene Republic. And it says right there, Serenissima Repubblica di Venezia. So Serenissima, and that actually had some validity. Venice was unconquered for a millennium, and indeed was basically untroubled compared to other governments. Now, Smith is appointed by King George III in June of 1744, and that gives the 31 prints constituting the series a date. Now, needless to say, dedicating the set of prints to the British consul seems to be a tactic to encourage English collectors. Those who are visiting Venice as part of the Grand Tour would have probably checked in with a local official, and etchings were ideal for travelers to take back with them. They were less expensive than paintings and more portable and lighter than marble sculptures. A book of etchings might even fit in the overhead compartment. Now, Venice also then was a very capitalist place. Only there could you spend $30 for a plate of spaghetti and think you got a bargain. But artists like Canaletto needed to find a broad market, needed a range of patrons, and so they sold paintings, but also prints and drawings, finished drawings. Not just preparatory ones, but ones that were appreciated as actual independent works of art. And Venetian artists had to scramble for sales, and they learned a thing or two about business practice in the process. It is with good reason that Shakespeare's play is not called The Merchant of Florence. Now, the top of the inscription, it says right here, vedute, that means scenes, and these prints were variously taken from nature, that is real places, or were made up, that is capricci. And both kinds of compositions show the skills of an artist, the ability to record the outside world accurately, but also the talent to invent scenes, to make up something that would be more curious, more varied, more beautiful than anything real. Now let's go inside the set and see how Canaletto tried to appeal to his viewers and his customers. One of the most famous in the set, and it's a truly beautiful impression upstairs, is the famous portico with a lantern, done around 1741 to 4. The composition is surprising. The scene recedes in planes, and much of the foreground is in shadow. And also you're left wondering, what is the central motif? There's a large, if nondescript house head-on in the background. Is that the main thing? Or is it the arch of this arcade? Or is the main thing the void of open sky? Or even the little lantern right here that hangs prominently and a little off-kilter? By not being about one thing, and note how the arch is pleasingly not aligned either, it's not centered within the page, the print is about much more. With remarkable efficiency, the print is full of contrasts and lighting. Notice how the foreground is plunged into darkness with small human figures in shadow. You particularly see them down here, over here. And the white of the paper, which is rendering sun on the buildings or bright clouds in the distance, conveys brilliant illumination. And this is the kind of visual experience that happens all the time in Venice. The buildings are quite close together, which you produce both shadows and shafts of strong light in close proximity. There's a lot to see in this little print. We viewers need to take our time. Moving from left to right, we can see this imposing palazzo here, a tomb here just beyond that. There's an altana, which is a wooden terrace or deck, not structurally part of a building, that's stuck on top of the building. They're still common in Venice today, and indeed the inclusion of this wooden terrace, this altana, makes clear that we are in Venice, even though this is an imaginary scene. And you see boat sails in the distance towards the right, and an imposing Roman temple with an entrance up a steep flight of steps at the far right. This is an architectural accretion of successive historical periods, a bit like the weeds and vines that with time have seemed to grow over all surfaces. Now, if we move in closer, we get a great sense of this texture. Remember that etchings are made by coating a copper plate with wax and then using an etching needle, a very fine point, to delicately draw on this surface. Wherever the wax is removed by lines or hatching or dots or squiggles, the acid will bite through to the copper surface, making spidery grooves that will then hold ink when the plate is put through a press. Now, Canaletto's line work, as you can see here, is very fine. His touch is sure. There aren't lines out of place. And the overall pattern seemed to swell and taper in waves, particularly visible in the foreground. Love these kind of sections here. And these wave-like surfaces begin to make sense coming from someone who has been around softly rippling water his entire life. Moving still closer, focusing on the top of the arch, we are struck by how tiny the lantern seems compared to the architectural forms. I mean, how could someone easily light or extinguish that lantern? Well, and how much illumination, in fact, could that lantern cast? I find myself smiling as I ponder this paradox. With the spatial recession, of course, the tiny lantern seems about the same scale as the much larger altana or wooden roof deck behind. And if we go right up to the lantern, we see the magic of its making, an amazing economy of means. Canaletto used just a few strokes, and particularly some repeated verticals there, and a lot of void. See, there's a lot of blank paper around this, and then that piece there to convey the metal structure and the glass panes that compose this lamp. Just extraordinary. I hope I don't need to remind you that all of this is far more impressive in person, right up in the exhibition. There, the individual lines can be sabered, and the overall contrasts of light and dark seem to spring right off the page. The juxtaposition of architectural styles from many periods, not to mention structures in various states of disrepair, prompt thoughts of the passage of time, indeed the inexorable march of time and the inevitable decay of both man and the man-made. You can't improve upon this etching. The sheer quality of Canaletto's print is underscored by comparing it to paintings that derive from it. And this is a work by a follower of Canaletto, and it does use a full palette, it's an oil painting, and a variety of brushwork to convey a range of surface colors: stone, plaster in disrepair, wood, and we are also assured the sky is indeed a dazzling blue. But the painting is trying too hard, I would say. In the process of conversion from print to painting, the magic has been lost. I feel such a painting is a bit like colorizing a classic film from the 1940s. You gain something, but you lose a lot more. Canaletto himself understood that adapting the composition for a new painting worked better than a word-for-word translation of the print into a different medium. And we see this here in an amazing painting, Westminster Bridge. So a few years later, in 1747, while in London, Canaletto painted this unusual view of the Thames River in London, seen from the underside of Westminster Bridge, then a new structure and one of the engineering marvels of the age. This point of view stresses the support structure that holds up the span, and the scale of these massive arches seem to dwarf the boats on the river, you see right here, and in the huge dome of St. Paul's right there in the distance. The dramatic contrast of the foreground dark and distant light is clearly borrowed from the etching of the portico with the lantern, and the off-center and undersized wooden pail, which is hanging from a rope at the upper right, replicates the lantern in the print. Now keep this bridge in mind and this view in mind, because we'll return to it when I tell you more about Casanova. Now, another thing about Canaletto, of course, is that he doesn't just do the major monuments, and these are some monuments. That is the Church of the Carità there. This was the scuola, or religious confraternity of the Carità, or charity. That is now the Accademia Museum. This is before the Accademia Bridge, which is one of the 3 permanent spans across the Grand Canal. It's a wooden bridge now, but had not been built then. And this is called the Stonemasons Yard, because all of these stones are being cut and shaped, and they're being used to build the Church of San Vidal, which is just actually behind us in the picture. So it's a scene, not so much of a monument, but daily life, things going on around these monuments. The wonderful sense of life happening. And this is part, of course, of a long tradition in Venice. Canaletto didn't invent this, but what's interesting there is there's no obvious religious scene happening. In earlier art, you see this from the 1490s, famous Carpaccio painting, The Miracle, the Relic of the Cross at the Rialto Bridge. This is for a cycle done for another confraternity or religious charitable group, that of Scuola San Giovanni Evangelista, and it's a whole bunch of it's a whole series of big paintings on canvas showing miracles caused by a certain relic. The relic is actually right up here in the picture. There's a boy who was possessed, and in the but it seems almost incidental. What really seems to be going on here is this wonderful sense of life happening in Venice. You have not the stone, but rather the wooden Rialto Bridge, a drawbridge built there, crossing the Grand Canal, people moving back and forth, and indeed a beautiful sunset happening. This is the bustle of Venice. Indeed, this is the Venice as a maritime and a merchant capital. But this is specifically a religious event, and one aspect of its incredible detail is to prove the veracity of the religious miracle. Of course, the boy on the upper left was exorcised successfully. Can't you tell everything in the picture that was there has been recorded? So this sense of piling on details to make a point. Now, I'd like to acknowledge next the valuable point of view of visitors to Venice. These foreign visitors, or forestieri, can be wonderfully perceptive in their descriptions of Venice. And here we have Goethe, right? One of the greatest foreign observers, Johann Wolfgang von Goethe, 1749 to 1832. He's traditionally the greatest writer in the German language. And he records beautifully his impressions of a 1786 visit to Italy. He does this in a series of letters that function as a diary, and they're full of wise observations, but also a very appealing childlike joy. And let's put on the screen for a minute the Museum of Fine Arts Boston's big Canaletto. It shows the Bay of Venice, or the Bacino di San Marco, and we can give the date, actually, of 1738, because in the original painting, if you look very closely, there's a teeny bit of scaffolding on that campanile, on that bell tower, and we know that the tower was hit by lightning the year before and repaired in 1738. So this is extremely accurate. We can get within about a year in dating this picture. Now, this painting was done about half a century before Goethe's visit, but it beautifully conveys the physical extent of the city. I mean, this is just one view of Venice, an enormous city, and also something of the hum of activity on the water of this maritime capital. And you can see some of the major monuments. This has been since torn down. This was a granary to store grain for times of famine. It's now a garden. That is the famous campanile, or bell tower of San Marco. In the Northern Europe, typically, your bell towers on your west end of your church. Think of most French and English cathedrals. In Italy, however, a bell tower is often a separate building. Think of Florence, or for that matter, the Leaning Tower of Pisa is the bell tower of Pisa Cathedral. And this is the campanile here, which is both the bell tower for the Church of San Marco, but also an amazing lookout post. You could see an approaching ship from many miles away. This large building was the Mint of Venice, where they coined coins that were used all over the Mediterranean. This little one here was the library. Big building here is the church, is the Palazzo Ducale, combination Capitol and White House. That is both where the committees that ran Venice met, and also where the Doge, the elected ruler for life, lived, had his apartments. Church of San Marco in the background, the prisons, which I'll get to in a minute right there, and this big palazzo here is now the Hotel Daniele. This long thing here is the Riva degli Schiavoni, a big set of quaysides and piers where ships could dock. So with a picture like this in mind, and all these ships, you've got the flags of England, France, Venice, and Denmark in the foreground. Goethe writes, and he's got a wonderful sense for the dramatic. Quote, "It was written then on my page in the book of fate that at 5 p.m. on the 28th day of September in the year 1786, I should see Venice for the first time, as I enter the lagoons from the Brenta Canal and soon afterward set foot in this beautiful island city." And then a little later he talks about how he finds his hotel called the Queen of England, and he writes that he's waiting for his parcel of clothes and other possessions to come from Germany. And then he goes on, he says, quote, "At last I can really enjoy the solitude I've been looking for, because nowhere can one be more alone than in a large crowd, through which one pushes one's way, a complete stranger. In all Venice, there's probably only one person who knows me, and it is most unlikely that I should meet him at once." End quote. Now this idea, because nowhere can one be more alone than in a large crowd, and it's totally true. It's a bit of kind of very witty formulation, anticipating perhaps Oscar Wilde, or maybe even Yogi Berra. But the idea, Venice is a great city for walking around by yourself. It's extremely safe. Just don't fall into the water and you'll be fine. Now, Goethe continues in a later entry, just 4 days later, September 30th, and he writes evening. So this is clearly written by candlelight or lamplight. And remember, this guy, Goethe, grew up in landlocked Frankfurt, Germany. He says, quote, "Today I bought a map of the city. After studying carefully, I climbed the campanile of San Marco. It was nearly noon, and the sun shone so brightly that I could recognize both close and distant places without a telescope. The lagoons are covered at high tide, and when I turned my eyes in the direction of the Lido, a narrow strip of land which shuts in the lagoon, I saw the sea for the first time." Kind of an amazing idea, just the first time you ever see the sea in your life, to be well into middle age. Now, with these dramatic words of a foreigner in our ears, let's linger on this great painting for a moment and consider Venice in the 18th century. It's a shell of an empire, though it still functions as an economic center and the playground of Europe. I do want to question this notion of Venice's decline, because in some ways Venice's decline, or this decadent period of the 18th century, has been exaggerated. Now, to be sure, Venice's military high point is the late 15th century, after which all the other major European powers managed to keep Venice very much in check. The conquest of Constantinople by the Ottoman Turks in 1453 suddenly meant there was a very powerful enemy in the Eastern Mediterranean, and the Ottoman Turks ensured a slow and continuous erosion of Venetian sea power and colonies in the Eastern Mediterranean. And in fact, there's a greater problem. By the later 16th century, a country didn't really want to be on the Mediterranean anymore. That was the wrong sea. The great powers of the 17th and 18th centuries, you'll recall, Spain, Portugal, France, England, Netherlands, all had ports on the Atlantic Ocean. But all the same, Venice was still, in the 18th century, one of the largest cities in Europe. It still had much of its land empire, or its terraferma, that remained on the mainland, northeast mainland of Italy. That was Venetian. And they had steady prosperity from the rich agricultural lands. Their system of government was intact century after century. Indeed, it was an inspiration for the founding of our own country. One reason we stagger the terms in the Senate, so 1/3 is elected every 2 years, based on a Venetian model. In fact, although there had been an ancient Roman Senate, the only Senate functioning in the world in the 1780s was this in Venice. So there had been no revolutions, no invasions, no palace coups. This country truly deserved the sobriquet Serenissima, most serene. And Venice was still immensely wealthy. Major buildings were going up constantly, and they employed some of the top artists in Europe, both imports and homegrown, to decorate these buildings and fill them with remarkable treasures. And both locals and foreigners mixed in fascinating ways, as we can learn from two insiders. Here are two insiders. Now, Casanova is not just an expression meaning womanizer or rascal. He was a flesh and blood person, just like the artist Canaletto. They're both born in Venice, and although a generation apart, you can see from their birth dates, Canaletto in 1697 and Casanova in 1725, they were both born in Venice and in kind of adjacent neighborhoods. As a young man, Casanova was very handsome, had a witty manner. He was a great public speaker, part of his training as a priest, a vocation which didn't stick. And he made friends easily. He was very tall and socially confident. Now, neither of these two figures were born well, particularly not Casanova, but Canaletto was at least born into an artisan's family. His father was a painter and designer of theater sets, and that's indeed where he got his start as an artist. And you can see something of that in the way he constructs his compositions of his paintings and his etchings. Now, both Casanova and Canaletto would mix with aristocrats, and Casanova often pretended to be one. He was traveled under assumed names, for example, often in disguise. But both Casanova and Canaletto were closer in origins to the working classes. And to get a sense of that, I want to show you cruder, simpler prints, but ones I like very much. This is the world of the working classes in Venice in a book by Gaetano Zampini, which is a book of the trades of the city of Venice, basically the street cries, the different professions on the lower end of the scale. On the left is a codega, who is a lantern bearer. He basically takes you around, keeps you from getting lost. And particularly if you're a foreigner, this could be very useful to hire him. And there's a little poem in the bottom which says basically, by night, whether to the theater or to the Rialto, which is the gambling hall, if you need a light, I'll take you there. It's enough to pay me, and I'll bring you anywhere. And then on the right is a fitarpalchi, which means literally box office. He has in his hand there a ring of keys, and those are the keys to the locked boxes within an opera hall. And you'll notice as well the presence of masks. A lot of these figures are masks. Now, masks are not just something you wear in 18th century Venice during the time of Carnevale. No, you'd wear it in lots of social situations. And it's kind of odd for us to think about. We think about being unmasked as being ourselves, but maybe you can most be yourself if you're somewhat pretending to be someone else. You'd wear this for gambling, business deals, opera, seductions. So it's quite interesting that people would do this all the time, and Casanova certainly indulged in this same practice. Now, Casanova himself was very theatrical. His mother was an actress, and he was trained on the violin. And whenever Casanova traveled to a new place in Europe, he would seek out theatrical types. He would look out for opera singers, ballerinas, actors, musicians. And in other parts of Europe, these types of people were typically Italians and often Venetian. It was a kind of specialized occupation. In this demi-monde world, you also found people who were refugees or prostitutes, courtesans in that world. But Casanova felt at home in this world. People putting on roles, people sometimes acting as someone else. This was his default. And Casanova himself played lots of roles. He was often, as I said, traveling under assumed names. He made up ideals or aristocratic terms he really hadn't earned. And he would do this not just, though, trying to further a business deal or a flirtation, but he also enjoyed the idea of playing himself, someone who was a celebrity. He would have fit totally in the kind of internet celeb news culture of our day. He was famous for being famous, and indeed loved playing this leading role of Casanova. And moving up a step from this world of people serving aristocrats and wealthy visitors, we go to the Rialto. And the Rialto is a gambling house, and these were supervised by the Venetian government that wanted their cut, but also wanted to make sure that important family businesses did not indeed go bankrupt. And so we see this. It's a wonderful thing of atmosphere. You see the cards on the ground. You'd also wonder how many cards are stuck in people's costumes or behind their sleeves to pull out. And it's a beautiful room there with leather-covered walls. People are wearing masks and beautiful bright colors. A lot's going on. You have to watch your wallet here. And Casanova is famous, as you probably know, for his voluminous memoirs. This is one of the longest autobiographies ever written. It's full of amazing observations and some racy bits. And they're not always accurate, clearly, because he's not a reliable narrator, let's say, but they're always entertaining. And Casanova corresponded with rulers, scientists, and writers all across Europe. He was truly a man of letters, but he was also a man of numbers. And not only did he have his own sense of scoring, that is, he liked to tally up his lovers, his flirtations, and his heartbreaks, but Casanova was obsessed with numbers. He loved numerology. He loved to think about proper ways to figure out a system to gamble correctly. Loved gambling. He would have fit right in here and lost a lot of money there. He also, in fact, was obsessed by lotteries, not so much as a game of chance, but as a business proposition. Casanova, in fact, in Paris in 1756, a little later in his life, convinced the king to set up the world's first national lottery. He got a cut of that. It made him, for the only time in his life, truly wealthy. And then he spent other times of his life trying to convince other rulers to set up lotteries to no avail. The idea had caught on. They didn't need him to figure it out. Now, there's something about rolling the dice and taking your chances with life that is very central to Casanova's personality. He thrived in this world, and clearly the subject of the Rialto also impressed artists and art collectors, people who wanted souvenirs of this thrilling milieu to take it back home. We see it here in this Guardi, or this very interesting painting by this German artist Tischbein, where you see people are wearing masks, looking out, and playing roles, enjoying themselves being someone else. Now, Casanova's aspirational world of the Venetian gambling hall and opera box still has a certain allure today. If you look there, you can see me. I'm at the Carnevale in Venice in 2010 playing traditional 18th century gambling games. And this is me leaving the Fenice Opera House, leaving an opera box later the same evening. A scene pretty similar, I hope you will agree, to the paintings I just showed you. And I suppose this gives me some credibility to talk about Venice in the age of Casanova and Canaletto. And going a little further, this is the floor plan. This is the major exhibition I'm working on that will be at the MFA in Boston and the Kimball Art Museum in Fort Worth, and then San Francisco in 2017-18 on the World of Casanova. And the idea is to show the places where he went, the people he met, structured loosely by chronology and geography, and sort of come in here and work your way through here. This is where he's put in prison. Nice seductions happening here. That's his time in Paris, London, travel, all the famous people he knew. And then you sort of exit there. And we'll include a big range of media, including costumes, prints, drawings, furniture, jewelry, really quite impressive things. And I wouldn't be surprised if a certain museum curator attends the exhibition opening in April of 2017 in a costume. Now let's look at the city of Casanova and Canaletto from above. Now the Grand Canal, you see, runs down the middle in a kind of backwards S, right, separating the city, a northern part and a southern part. Now, the city of Venice has been divided since really the early Middle Ages, not into quarters, but into sixths. So that is 6 different sections, or sestieri, and the districts still bear those names today. You can see Santa Croce, the upper left, then San Polo, a little bit to the right, towards the where the Rialto markets and towards the Rialto Bridge. And then there, Cannaregio, this big one that goes from the far left over along the top, really about half of that. San Marco is the one down below in the kind of bulge of the Grand Canal. That is it's always been the central, most prestigious and important part of Venice, really, the district around the Church of San Mark's, the Piazza San Marco. And then Castello, this one far to the east, castle-like, because that's where the arsenale is, where the ships were built that staffed Venice's fleets and navies. So that's to the far east. In fact, the arsenale you can see on this map is this enormous section here where they could construct large sailing ships. And then finally, Dorso Duro, or the hardback, which is this bottom part of Venice, which goes from the beginning of the Grand Canal all the way back here to that end. And there you can see, in fact, their 2 birthplaces. They were born in adjacent neighborhoods. Casanova here, not on the canal, which is telling, a little bit in, right, and Canaletto not far. Both of them in the San Marco district. And there you can see in San Samuele, that's a little close-up with Casanova's house marked right near the church of San Samuele. That's the birthplace with a plaque there on the Cala Malipiero, a rather humble house. And then Canaletto's birthplace, further inland, maybe an 8-10 minute walk. And helpfully, for people who admire the artist as much as I do, there's actually a Hotel Canaletto right there, so you can find the place. And then we're back to the city, now in the full map. Now, what is truly amazing, though, is that Venice in the 18th century, the age of Casanova and Canaletto, looks more or less the same today. Or to put another way, both of our people would figure out how to get around. They would recognize most of the structures that are still standing. And you can't say that for almost any other European city. They've been completely altered in the past 250 years. Now, one has to know a city very well to interpret creatively its landmarks, and certainly Canaletto did. And we can see his knowledge in the view of San Giacomo di Rialto. Oh, by the way, this is a modern view of this right here. You can see this has been expanded here along the back. This big port's been put in. The Giudecca Island's a little wider, and the Giardini, which is now where they have the Biennale art exhibition, that is expanded, replaced a number of monasteries. This was Napoleon's decree when he invaded Venice to have a public garden. That's Venice modern, and that's Venice from the air, and it looks very similar to that early 18th century map. But this here, we have the imaginary view. You'll see an impression in the exhibition of San Giacomo di Rialto, traditionally thought to be the oldest church in Venice. And this was the center, this square, the center of Venetian banking and insurance, the Wall Street. But interestingly, there's the ruins of an ancient Roman colonnade, of which you, of course, don't see in Venice. And you compare it to Canaletto's painting of the same church from about 20 years before the print, and you can see they swapped the thermal window here for a big portico in the print. The clock was made smaller in reality, and the number of bells reduced from 3 to 1 from the painting to the etching. He's also, in the print, you don't see the Rialto Bridge, which crosses to the San Marco side. But both of these, though, it's recognizably the print's clearly that place, and both the print and the painting share an expansive sky. When you have a completely flat city like Venice, artists are drawn to include a low horizon line and put lots of drama up in the sky in the form of beautiful clouds. Now, some of Canaletto's etchings are very accurate. This is the Pietra del Bando, or the Stone of Proclamation, right here on the corner of St. Mark's Church with the Doge's Palace in back. You can see people here. They're listening to proclamations being read from this kind of podium. And then you turn the corner, and you go around this way, and there's a painting showing how similar the two are. And you'll find yourselves on the Molo, or the port, with the Riva degli Schiavoni, or the Quay of the Slavs, going down this way. And this big, imposing, pretty frightening-looking building is the prisons. And this is the setting of one of Casanova's most famous episodes. On the 26th of July, 1755, he was arrested by the Venetian authorities. Though they did not tell him exactly what he had done, he had offended many in Venice through alchemy, blasphemy, Kabbalah, debt, heresy, and much more. The whole thing was lumped together under the charge of, quote, a question of religion, and he was given a 5-year sentence. They wanted to shut him up, and he was led across the Bridge of Sighs, which goes between the courts and the Doge's palace, right across there into that forbidding building of the prisons. You can see details here, and we move forward. And a beautiful painting. That's the Bridge of Sighs right there. The sigh, S-I-G-H, the point a prisoner condemned would get his last glimpse of the outside world of freedom, sigh, and then be taken across into his cell. Now, Casanova was locked in a tiny cell. He was both desperate and furious, and he writes later in his memoirs, quote, I realized I had ended up in a place where the false seemed true and reality seemed a sort of bad dream, where the mind seems to lose its abilities and a deformed imagination can make one the victim of either chimerical hope or terrible desperation. I made a decision to keep all my wits about me, drawing upon all the philosophy I had in my soul, but which I never had the occasion to use. So he was able to bribe people, bring in some food and some books, but never before had any one prisoner escaped from these famous prisons in Venice. But Casanova resolved to do so. He found an iron spike when he was allowed to do a walk up in the attics of these buildings. It was part holding up the high ceilings in these buildings, the Doge's palace, and he used that to dig at the floorboards of his cell. He was making real progress. But then, unfortunately, he was transferred to a new cell. This was supposed to be a favor to him. One of his protectors had tried to help him out, but it came at the absolute worst time. But in the new cell, he managed to get along well enough with his cellmate, a renegade priest named Balbi, and they figured out how to escape through the ceiling. And also, they did so on a holiday, on All Souls Day, October 31st, 1756. The jailers, of course, had the day off, right? The prisoners were supposed to just stay there and uncomfortably for a couple days without any attention. But Casanova makes it through the ceiling, and then in the sort of big space underneath the roof, he's able to pry his way some of the lead plates of the roof. It was a full moon that night, and they were worried the shadows would make them very visible up there on the roof, give their presence away. It did not, though. Then they found a skylight down into the Doge's palace itself, so that's the Palazzo Ducale in a kind of legitimate part, but they were still locked in. Now, they earlier that night had tried to cut their hair and shave themselves as much as they could with their knives, and they were able to change back into the clothes they had with them when they were arrested, which made them look not like prisoners, but rather somewhat scruffy aristocrats. And within an hour or two, they were spotted by a guard inside the Doge's palace, and they managed to convince him that they were aristocrats who had simply fallen asleep after a long meeting and been locked inside. So the door was opened, and they walked right out the main entrance. Casanova is just such a good plotter. He's fantastic. He loudly calls for a gondola, take me to Fusina. A lot of people overheard him first thing in the morning. As soon as he's in the gondola, he says, not Fusina, but Mestre. That is a different place to throw them off the scent. And Mestre is right near Marghera. Here you see a beautiful print showing the edge of the lagoon with this old fortification, sense of daily life, boys catching eels, people, fishermen in other boats. Casanova showing up in his gondola would not really be noticed, and he could escape. I should mention, though, here, the thing on the right is the bestseller that Casanova wrote about his escape, writing in French, The History of My Flight from the Prisons of Venice, called The Leads, 1787. This was a European-wide bestseller. Now, although the escape from the prisons is his most famous episode, he comes down to us in popular culture as a seducer, and he was known for that as well as for his failed seductions, and a number of these took place with nuns. Now, if you are a girl in a upper class of aristocratic Venetian family, and you happen to be the firstborn girl, well, you'll get a dowry. You can be married off. It's not so hard. If you're a younger daughter, you might be parked in a convent, perhaps against your will. And if we look. And here we see a painting by Guardi, the Parlatorio, or the speaking room. And you can see here, nuns here, looks a bit like a prison, which is unfortunately intentional. These are nuns here behind this grill, and they're having visits from their family members, their uncle, who might be their boyfriend perhaps, and to make sure the kids don't really understand what's going on, they're watching a puppet show right here. Amazing example of this, of the kind of fluid social life. You could pass letters back and forth, but indeed it was clear who was trapped in and who could go and come freely. And this shows a beautiful Canaletto painting, quite unusual. It's very wispy, and you feel the sense of mist on the lagoon. We're looking north, or the upper edge of Cannaregio. These are San Michele and San Cristoforo, which have now been joined to make one island where the cemeteries are. In the distance is Murano, the famous place for glass blowing for centuries and still to the present day. But on the island of Murano, a quieter place, one could have assignations and trysts. And indeed, there was a certain convent, Santa Maria degli Angeli. Some of the nuns there did not behave like angels. Two of Casanova's girlfriends were there. One, Caterina Capretta, known by the initials of CC in his autobiography. And then later he has an amazing affair with an older nun whose initials are MM. We don't know her real name. Casanova was at least enough of a gentleman not to tell everything. But these in his diaries, his memoirs, it's so exciting and fun. These past notes and assignations and messages that don't get sent, and it's quite exciting. He has a tryst in a little cottage in Murano, somewhere in the distance of this picture. With a meal first always, right? Champagne plus various dishes kept warm on steaming water. Lots of flirting and wit his first night with MM, but no lovemaking the first time around. For Casanova, sometimes the appeal was often in the anticipation. And let's move to a decidedly cruder sense of painting here to give a sense of what is, these experiences of Casanova in these convents. You can see a very pretty young nun there. But this painting by Martin van Muytens, from right in the period of Casanova, it's actually a two-sided painting. That's the back. So it's a little bit of 18th century erotica, and this idea of things not being what their outside appearance first indicate is perfectly right for Casanova's era. Now, we should also make clear, though, the 18th century is a lot more like our own licentious era. It's the 19th century in between that was Victorian and much more straight-laced about sexuality. Now, both of our Venetians, Casanova and Canaletto, spend important time in London. They find themselves both there mid-career. Canaletto's in London in the late 1740s and early 1750s, 9 years total. And Casanova's there for about 9 months in 1763. Both of them, of course, must have seen the River Thames as an even wider version of the Grand Canal. And in London is where poor Casanova had one of his greatest frustrations as a lover. He met a gorgeous young woman, Anne-Marie Charpillon, 18 years old, elegant, very attractive, beautifully educated, and Casanova wanted to set her up as his kept woman. They agreed on a high price, but when it came to the crucial moment, she held back. There was a court case for breach of promise. Both were totally ashamed by the public embarrassment, and she becomes suddenly ill and was predicted to die. So Casanova then felt terrible. He, one, didn't get his girlfriend, and two, he thought that he might have caused her death. And indeed, this is an important thing about Casanova. It's not just about the sex, at least what he claims in his book. For him, it was the pursuit, it was the sense of falling in love. He loved the giddiness about it and the butterflies for him. So he thought he had really done a terrible thing, and Casanova decides to kill himself. Now, as promised, we're back at Westminster Bridge, the slide I showed you at the beginning of this lecture. Casanova resolves that to kill himself, he's going to put on his biggest overcoat, he's going to fill his pockets with heavy objects, lead weights, etc. He resolves to jump off. It makes perfect sense that a Venetian would see the easiest form of suicide, of course, to be drowning. But as he's contemplating, he's just above this span here, looking out at this world, which is not that far in its appearance from Venice, a friend interrupts him. This man, Sir Welbore Ellis Agar, who was a kind of cheery frat boy, said, "Casanova, you look glum. I think you need a drink with me. In fact, you need a drink, a woman, and beef and Yorkshire pudding." And that was the end of the suicide attempt. And it's kind of wonderful with this picture. It's as if Canaletto had anticipated the stage where this great scene in Casanova's life would not play out. Now let's skip ahead a century and a half. As you see in the exhibition upstairs is a lovely little alcove about Whistler and his followers, 1879, 1880. As American printmakers in Venice. And they, of course, know Canaletto well, but they're doing yet a different take. Whistler is so important because, first, there's some of these prints are extremely spare. You see some upstairs where there's very few lines at all making up the composition. But he has a new conception of Venice. He abandons almost completely the major monuments and instead dwells completely on the hidden corners. It's like he's taken one of the little vignettes at the margins of a Canaletto etching of Venice and then makes it the main motif. But what is particularly picturesquely crumbling in a Canaletto verges on squalor in Whistler. I just love this one and this turn in the canal with these doorways here, one open, one closed. Real sense of atmosphere, almost a sense of stench. And I'd like to end, though, moving right up to our time, with an artist, a contemporary take on Venice. This is the photographer Matthew Pillsbury, and he specializes in long exposures. The point is that the monument remains steady, but the people move through them, and they're captured as wispy impressions of their presence. This is inside the Accademia Museum, the unveiling of Titian's Presentation of Mary. This, in fact, was a restoration done by Save Venice, and at the night of the party, the instructions were wear white, which almost everyone did, and you see them moving through this space, looking up and admiring Titian's painting and that whole room. This is a beautiful one. Same month, you see the tracks of the boats coming both on the Grand Canal and then making a detour right here at Palazzo Barbaro for a ball. And then a favorite one here to bring us back to Piazza San Marco. We see Acqua Alta, that's the title, the seasonal flooding, coming up in the middle. And then lights off of the buildings on the side, and then someone's smartphone in the foreground. It's just a wonderful sort of soft image with the people moving through in a beautiful blurry appearance. Now, I don't know what Canaletto would have made of these vedute, but I'm certain that Casanova would have enjoyed him. He would have found something in these, I believe, in these photographs of Matthew Pillsbury to spark reminiscences of scrapes, exploits, lucky breaks. Indeed, Casanova understood that in Venice, above all cities, it's not just the buildings that endure, but also the ghosts. Thank you. Thank you. Great. Thank you. I'd be happy to take a few questions. Anyone out there? There we go. Okay. Thanks, Simon.
Say Venice and modern day Venice. What's the progress in preventing cruise ships from damaging the foundations?
Okay, very good question about cruise ships, foundations of buildings. It's a tricky thing. Let's put it this way. In the 1920s, to try to solve the economic problems of Venice, a very large industrial campus, let's say, was area of factories was built on the mainland. You've seen this when you take the train in or fly in Marghera and Mestre. And that included oil refineries, steel, glass, things like that. Terrible pollutants. You shouldn't have never put these things next to such a fragile city. But the idea is this would provide, jobs at good wages, etc. Cruise ships, by contrast, are somewhat lower impact. They're lower polluting, and there's obviously a lot of money in tourism. The problem is, indeed, even when a big boat moves slowly, it still displaces a huge amount of water. And as we saw with the Costa Concordia a few years ago off the Tuscan coast, if a really big building gets too close to shallow water, a boat gets too close, and of course it can run aground. Now, running aground is bad enough in a nature preserve, but imagine if it does it and knocks off the edge of a church or an old palazzo. So that is indeed a worry. There's substantial money involved. Say Venice doesn't take a particular political line on this, just like we don't endorse, mayoral elections or something like that. But, I think we'd love to figure out a way that tourists could continue to come and enjoy Venice, that there could still be a good, a strong visitors economy, but indeed have the boats maybe go in a different route. But you're right. This is a potential problem that is out there. Another question? Come on, Dartmouth. Oh, here we go.
Canaletto ended up in England because of patronage problems. Is that the case, or why was?
Well, there's the War of Austrian Succession in the 1740s, and the Grand Tour kind of slows down. People are not coming through in the same way, and like a good capitalist, he goes to his market. And he ends up painting views of Venice, though, in England. Many of these he does from drawings or even from memory. He also does a certain number of painting people's country homes. Just like today, you can get someone to paint your dog or your house. So he does that. And it's interesting that when he gets there, he finds people kind of turning out Canalettos, and he's astonished. Like he had done well enough, and enough of his pictures have been brought back to England that he already had Italians posing as him, in effect, there. So this is another interesting question, before identity checks and things, and indeed it's completely congruent with Casanova's world. You could pretend to be someone else and get away with it for quite a while. Someone else?
How long was Casanova in London?
He's only there about 9 months, and the guy is always on the move in part because he's trying to make money, and his big thing is lotteries, and he wants a royal audience. He gets one with George III and Queen Charlotte, and he tries to impress, and they're not interested. He goes to other places, though, tries to sell the same thing. Then he also is trying to sell secrets of silk manufacturing. And being a Venetian, that's impressive. Also glass blowing, numerology. He's, in some ways, he's a scoundrel. In other ways, he's a Renaissance man. So he knew about a lot of subjects. But he stays in England long enough. This court case where he tried breach of promise with his intended mistress, that is really embarrassing. And he's kind of humiliated. But this is really telling. He never really learns to speak English. He could do very well speaking French and pretty well speaking Italian in England. And there's a wonderful anecdote that Kitty Fisher, who was the #1 courtesan in London, she was the most glamorous, sexy, well-dressed prostitute there, and she was famous. I mean, she's painted by Reynolds and Hone and lots of artists. They make a deal. She offers a pretty high price to go to bed with him, and he accepts. But then he realizes, wait a second, I don't speak English, and you don't speak Italian or French. And much of the fun of going to bed with somebody is the conversation. So for him, he says, forget it, which is like it's an amazing idea to think about that. But I think that anecdote redounds something to his credit. One more? Up front?
As I read about Canaletto, there seemed to be, back to Canaletto, so many different theories why he started working on these etchings, why he stopped, whether it was more personal artistic expression, he was bored with his paintings, or whether it was commercially motivated. Why did he invest so much of himself in creating these stunning works? Or is it Joseph Smith who's pushing this?
No, there's a question of why did he start etching? Why did he stop? Why put so much attention to it in a relatively brief amount of time and then not keep going? I don't have an answer. What's interesting, though, is he gets it very quickly. We have to assume there are experiments that didn't survive. He tore up struck through the plates. He does them very successfully, but maybe he thought he had done enough with it. It's not clear. I mean, I think the world wishes he had done more etchings, but it's relatively restricted within his career. Exhibition upstairs makes clear, though, that when he did this, he had really made a full statement. I mean, it's kind of like he is on a kind of miniature scale done anything you really could do with an etching in that period. He doesn't explore plate tone and things that Whistler does so well 150 years later, but he proves that he can accurately reproduce Venetian monuments, that he can slightly tweak them, and then he can completely make up new settings, that is capricci. And maybe he just felt that he had said enough and would go back to his paintings. So I will keep thinking about that. Thank you very much, everyone. Thank you.